start with a quotation. In all the book clubs, I normally start with a quotation. So the quote that I've picked to start this morning is also going to later on prove to be, is also not prove to be, but is also going to be the first point of discussion. And it's this: at that moment, I saw the plain truth, ended what marked the culminating point of the first phase of my psychological reaction. I struck out my whole former life. An important point, because it is at that moment, obviously, that Viktor Frankl realizes that his life is going to change in a way, I mean, completely. So before we start the conversation, I'd like to ask you, at least 2 or 3 people, what reactions about the book? What did you think about the book? Loved it, hated it, indifferent? Use your raise hand icon. Shout out to Marianne Camera joining us from Cape Town, South Africa.
It was a transformative book. It allowed me to gather back my agency. It was one of those books which I recommend to anyone who's going through a really difficult time, because you always have the choice, the attitude. And so I loved every minute of the book.
So somebody, Frida, I see this. Wow, 5th time reading it. Maybe you can tell us a little bit. Loved the book, hated it, indifferent.
It's one of those books that you read and every time you get a new perspective on how to live life.
Yes.
I think the fact that we're living through these COVID times now and there are hardship times for everybody, we're sort of learning new ways of doing things. And one of the things that has come to the fore is how is your mind set to deal with such problems? We are always set for success. We are not set for failure. So we never know how to deal with failure at any point in time, because our schooling system does not allow us to actually deal with failure from that perspective. Like, everybody's going to pick you up at some point in time. And this is one of the times when we are actually realizing that failure is not a bad thing. It's actually something that makes you grow. It's something that gives you perspective on life from a different perspective. So that's why I really love this book, and that's why I chose to read it again. Thank you.
Okay, very good. And then I'm going to take one last comment about reactions to the book, maybe 2 last comments. One is from Israel, Prof. Israel, please. If you can share your reactions to the book.
I'm greeting you all from Diani Beach, as you can see. Anyway, I have read this book a number of times. I don't remember how many, but I have preached about this book quite a bit. And I have never met anybody I recommended this book who came back to me and told me I didn't like, or it's okay. No, this book actually is an amazing book, and I think it, when I read it for the first time, it's changed the way I see things. It kind of creating a new paradigm. So the issue of finding meaning in your life as a prerequisite for everything is great. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. And then finally, Caroline Shisubili, you have an interesting take on your reactions to the book.
Yes, as I said there, I read this book like 20 years ago, and for the first time, probably I didn't understand it as much as I read further and repeatedly. And what struck me most is that one needs reason to live another day, what I summarize as hope. So it's a very interesting book, especially the first part. The second part, I think it's for psychologists. Yes, thank you.
Okay, so everybody. Thank you so much. So everybody loved the book. Everybody found something worthwhile in this book. So now I want to go back to the comment that Viktor Frankl makes, and it's what launched us into the book club discussion, which was, at that moment, I saw the plain truth and did what marked the culminating point of the first phase of my psychological reaction. I struck out my whole life. My whole former life, sorry. Why is this a significant moment, do you suppose? Why was it so important that at that point, he realizes things have changed, and he strikes out his whole former life and, well, engages with this reaction, with camp life. Why do you think that was an important turning point? Oh, thank you, Prof. I see your raised hand.
Okay, I think this is a very important question, because I think you have to embrace, accept reality as a prerequisite to transform in it. If he were to decide at that moment to live on his past, on his life that went, the feelings, etc., he would have chosen a ghost. He said, no, I have to accept what I can't change. I am in Auschwitz. Things are going to be hard, but that is reality for me. And that was the essential thing.
Absolutely. You'll notice that at the point where he actually says this statement is when, remember, he's got this fantastic manuscript of his research, and anyone who's been engaged in research just understand how much soil, blood, and tears goes into it. So at that moment, he goes in and he says, he's trying to share with the camp a person saying, oh, look, I've done this research and it's really, really important. And he's trying to communicate this to this guy. And the guy looks at him and swears at him and tells him, basically that's rubbish, And it was such a fantastic telling moment, like, okay, if this doesn't matter and if this is the reaction, then what are we looking at? Frida, you want to add on to that?
Yes, I'd like to add on to that. It is that you get to a point in life where you realize that your back is against the wall and there's nowhere else to go. So you strike back. You tell life, you know what? I'm here to live. I'm here to make a difference. And I was watching a TED talk the other day about being one person in 400 billion chances of living a life. And I thought, being that one person in that 400 billion makes a very big difference in this life. And maybe I'd like to ask another question. And it is that when reading books about the Holocaust, I was reading Primo Levi's If This Is Man. And the way the story is written is sort of an indirect way of talking about the Holocaust. Like, you don't give the full story because there's a narrative that it didn't happen. There's a narrative that people say this was just a figment of somebody's imagination, but the people who lived it actually did live it. And what does that say about human nature in terms of how we sort of try to hide things so that we don't have to give the story as it is, but still tell the story? And this is very poignant in this book because when he tells the story, he's actually quite removed from it, but still involved in it in terms of trying to give the message that he's supposed to give, and how that impacts us in terms of what we project out there as opposed to what is really in our hearts. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Frida. And also it's a bit, I think, to pick up on a point that you make, it's about denial, which is also what Professor Isail is talking about. It's about denial and acceptance of the truth. Nicholas, I see you, but I just want to make this statement. So therefore, at that point in time, one has to make a decision whether you're going to accept or deny, which probably, I'm sure, at least I know I was living with people who were denying that COVID was really happening. And it took them, like, literally, it's incredible, like almost 3 to 4 weeks for them to actually accept that, look, this is really happening. We really have curfew. This is, we're going through this. Nicholas, the last statement, and then we move on to the next point. Nicholas, please.
Just speaking from what you've said, I had a friend who was like, for the longest time, was living in denial. Like, this COVID thing really didn't exist until the president announced some drastic measures. That's when it hit her that, oh my goodness, this is real. So, but back to the question, the part of striking out my whole former life. I think for me, when I came to read this book, in page 93, there's an element where he says, with the end of uncertainty, there came the uncertainty of the end. So based on that, I think when he stepped in Auschwitz, he realized things have really changed. I don't know how long I'll be here, whether in fact I will even make it out, whether there is even that element of thinking out. So I really have to come up with a new way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And for that reason, then, you see, he had to forget everything else he knew.
Yes, yes, yes. So to move forward, this person had to accept that, however horrific, because part of the denial is because something happens in your life that is so unbelievable, so either horrifying, or sometimes it can be so wonderful, right? But in this case, we're discussing with a horror that is so horrific that it takes you a minute to just accept that, okay, this has actually happened to me and it is happening now. And you wake up in the morning and you realize yesterday was real and this thing has happened. Now we move on then to the next point, which was the second stage. When we move on to the second point is the second stage, then after realizing that, okay, this is happening, the prisoner moves from the first phase to the second phase, which was the phase of relative apathy, in which he achieved a kind of emotional death. Right, people? This was the stage where he achieves a kind of emotional death. And after that, they say, apathy was a necessary mechanism of self-defense, reality deemed, and all efforts and all emotions were centered on one task, preserving one's own life and that of the other fellow. Let's talk about that a little bit. So now one moves from the stage of, okay, this is happening and they accept, to the stage of apathy. There's nothing I can do about this. This thing is too big for me. When you were reading the book, what reasons, or how did you understand, why was it necessary for one to give into apathy? How is it they arrived at this point of apathy, these people? We're given the first reason, remember? He says it, about survival. How would the necessity of survival lead them? Very good, Caroline Shisubili, yes?
Thanks again. I think the first thing is just like, how do I live to see tomorrow? Mm-hmm. Because if I react, if I say something, I will be shot dead. I have seen others shot dead. Mm-hmm. And you see, the first human instinct is self-preservation. So I want to live, but anyway, I don't know why I want to live, because as he said, the uncertainty of uncertainty. Mm-hmm. But still deep down, I want to live. Therefore, I think as you move on in the book, you see how they wait for the piece of bread. They have to share. They wait for something, even little, to eat. Mm-hmm. So that instinct of self-preservation. Thank you.
Oh, okay, so you're raising two ideas actually. There's the one which is the looking for the piece of bread, which is now he talks about hunger, fatigue. Then the second one is where he talks about self-preservation. We'll extrapolate that point a bit further. Frida, apathy, why was it necessary and why was that a good thing?
I think it was a good thing because then you step away from the situation and try to regroup your thoughts into what it is that you can do and what you cannot do. I mean, reading any of these books about the Holocaust, there was a bit of lack of control in terms of anybody could do anything and they'd get away with it, especially against the victims. So if you fought too hard, then you lost your life, which was not necessary because maybe you'd save it to fight another day. Mm-hmm. And being apathetic or being totally unconcerned about the situation helped you to be able to preserve your energies to be able to live another day. Mm. And I think it was also because of the fact that what Caroline just said, preservation of life and knowing that at this particular point, there's nothing I can do, but maybe if I'm able to just lay low, I will live to die another day. Thank you.
Okay, very good. DK, I see your hand raised up.
I take it like why apathy was emotional death was, I think it's the height of acceptance of your situation.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is where you come to resign, to accept this is the current situation, this is the life I am in, this is my strengths, this is what I can and I cannot do.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist, but many of them say that for any breakthrough, it has to first start with acceptance, which is at some form, because if you, why I relate him saying emotional death is, I'm relating to the emotions he's thinking of as disbelief, non-acceptance, unwillingness, bitterness. You get what I'm saying? Reacting back to the situation instead of coming to a mindset of this, I am here, this is my present, this is my now, this is what I can, this is what I cannot do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to call out Nicholas. I saw your hand, but I have a question. Please, people also recall that when he talks about apathy and the necessity of becoming apathetic, let's say that, was linked to having a normal reaction, an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation, which was therefore normal. Remember, he says that. So Nicholas, let's talk a little bit about that. Oh yes, and then I see Prof. Israel. Nicholas.
My understanding was that based on what you've said,
Mm-hmm.
it is normalizing the abnormal.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like you check out from your past and everything that you knew,
Mm-hmm.
and now come into another reality
Mm-hmm.
where your emotions are not relevant.
Wait, but yes, but remember, Nicholas, do you remember, or somebody, do you remember he talks about when, for example, they were removing the human waste and it splashes on your face, and that's it's treated, you're beaten for that. So now you had to be passive. One had to be passive, not to react even when something is, or normal as human waste falling on your face does that. So now carry on with that in mind, Nicholas. Expand it a bit where you're going with that in mind.
So that means like they checked out.
Mm-hmm.
They were like zombies of some sort.
Mm-hmm.
You see, zero emotion, and for that reason, I think for that in page 93, what I came to say is that most regarded that the life is already past.
Mm-hmm.
So they've lost opportunities. I mean, they've lost everything really, and soon they will also lose their lives. So let's just go through the motions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
absolutely. This is it. They needed to kill themselves. And Professor, before we go on now to the next point.
Okay, then I wanted to say also that methinks that there is the emotional death is not exactly a tool. It is a kind of a reaction of somebody who did not quite agree with the reality before him or her, and therefore lowered the expectations to the minimum. You see, because some people may think that actually for me to be happy, I have to lower expectations. So that if I don't expect much from this situation or this person, even if he or she does nothing or does something even evil to me, I will be okay. You see, but this is a me thinks that is a negative way, and that I also think that it is a denial or a way of denying reality.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but in this particular case, when they needed, remember, later on they talk about, so now I'm talking about the three reasons. Thank you so much, Prof. Yeah, so this is it. So the first is they needed to die emotionally in the sense that they needed to, this was the reaction that they came up with because one could not did not want to be noticed. Remember when they talk about that, they were always like sheep being herded back and forth. And so you hunker down, right? They had to hunker down so that they're not seen, that they're not doing anything which will make them be noticed by the couples. The second reason is they needed to give into apathy because of the fatigue and the hunger. They literally had no resources to start doing anything, right? So the tendency to apathy was quite high. And of course, then the third one is the inferiority complex. The tendency to, we'll talk about the third one, inferiority complex, a bit later on, okay? So because you were made to feel that you were nothing, there was no value placed on you, on your life, on your existence. So after some time, one begins to really think, maybe I do not matter. I'm just one more number, you see? And so for that reason, there was this tendency to just sink down and be apathetic and become this tool that was moved from one place to the other. Now, in fact, I'm going to share screen with you for the third reason, where they were talking about about the inferiority complex. What are we told here? That majority of the prisoners suffered, I hope you see it, majority of the prisoners suffered from a kind of inferiority complex. We had all once been or had fancied ourselves to be somebody. Now we were treated like non-entities. Yeah. Now there's a conversation I want us to very briefly go into. It was beautiful when Frankl introduces this. The consciousness of one's inner value is anchored in higher, more spiritual things and cannot be shaken by camp life. But how many free men, let alone prisoners, possess it? What is the point that Frankl is making here for us? You see, the third reason why people were given to apathy is because they suddenly they suffered an inferiority complex. And of course, when you read this, you think, oh, but they should have known. Yeah, one thinks, but they should have known that, of course, they're not inferior, that they are human beings with dignity, etc., etc., etc. And it is that, and for this reason, in a parenthesis, Frankl introduces this idea that, the knowledge of one's inner value, that don't worry how they treat you in the camp, don't worry about these things, is anchored on your value comes from much higher things, not from, the way these people are treating you. But he says, look, how could one find that in some people don't even have it in normal life, let alone here in this camp. Do you have any reactions to this when you read this, especially the latter, the statement that he puts in parentheses, the knowledge that one, that yes, the way they were treated in the camp was a tendency to make them feel inferior. They developed an inferiority complex. And sometimes life, it's a process of recognizing that one is actually, one has to go through the process of recognizing this, and sometimes forget camp life, even in normal life. This is a bit difficult.
Yes, I think one of the things that Frankl teaches us is about self-knowledge. And it's something we lack quite a lot. And in this era of COVID, when you have to sort of stay indoors and by yourself most of the time, you realize that there's a whole load of things you didn't know about yourself, how your reactions go, what your responses will be to how people will communicate with you, and especially when now most of the communication is actually through email. How do you interpret all those things? And I like the thing about the higher self, about the spirituality, about having something that is beyond us, that anchors us. And getting that is a bit of a problem, because even under normal circumstances, when you're through the grind of life, we don't realize that there's something that is bigger than us, because we're sort of just moving along. But now when you get into a situation where it's really beyond you, that's when you actually try to think, okay, what can I do? And then you realize it's not about me. It's about that higher being anchoring me to something that is greater than me. And I think I read something today in the morning, and it said, your happiness does not depend on my happiness alone. If I make others happy, or if I make somebody smile, then somehow in the process, I'll also smile. And I think that is the thing about finding the higher being in all of us, because it is there, but we don't normally have it because we haven't explored those aspects of our lives that need that, especially in the daily grind of life. But when you have to stop and think about it, then you realize, oh my God, there's something higher than me, and that is what actually keeps me moving. Thank you.
Indeed. Just to deconstruct where you're going with this, Frida, is that, you see, the value one has is not because, well, of course, yes, it's who you are, but whose you are, right? So you are important not because people treat you as important. One is important not because, you know, of the titles and the place that they hold in society, but the recognition of that in yourself, one has an innate dignity, an innate value, etc. That recognition, yeah, is important, yeah. Now, obviously, when they went into the camp and they were treated very badly, like a number, literally. So you were no longer so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, etc. But rather one is treated like a number day after day. If in real life, the value they had placed on themselves had been on the fact that they're a bank manager, then of course, when you come here and you're no longer a bank manager, then naturally there was a tendency precisely to having this inferiority complex. And so this is the reason that we are given for the people enjoying, having to experiencing this inferiority complex. We then move on to the next idea, and you realize then, so then the question comes, and he asks such an interesting question, did he not? Because he said, so what kind of a cultural life? Yeah, he says we all experience a sort of cultural hibernation. Here's the question, why did Viktor Frankl even want to discuss the idea of a cultural life? I mean, we're in a camp, you know, they were just trying to survive. We would have understood this book, you know, of course, if all he ever talked about was, oh, and then this is what we did, we killed each other, and then we hunted for food, and we slept. And that makes a lot of sense if we only focus on the survival issues. But he introduces an interesting idea, and this is the idea of a cultural life. And of course, he says that we went into a sort of cultural hibernation. So let me I'm sharing my screen with you to share how he introduces this idea of cultural hibernation. In general, there was also a cultural hibernation. I'm in the camp, sorry. I mentioned the art is there. I mentioned art is there. Is there such a thing in a concentration camp? Question mark. There were songs, poems, jokes, some with underlying satire regarding the camp. All were meant to help us forget, and they did help, right? But why is he even talking about a cultural life in the first place? There's a hint in the statement that he makes. Yes, Caroline?
Human beings have dignity, but that dignity is enhanced when the other person recognizes it and promotes it and all that, which didn't happen in the concentration camps because the guards were very harsh on them and they devalued them, and that's what they felt. Mm-hmm. But I see someone like Viktor Frankl in there with the other campers, came in as a doctor, and I'm sure there were other professions. Mm-hmm. In a way, gives them a ray of hope, because as he works and treats them, he's recognizing that they are human beings and they are important, and there's something there that can be, you know, they can hang on. But just very quickly into another point which you just asked is
yes,
the fact that they lost, of course, the external freedom of movement and anything else, but they still had the intrinsic freedom, the inner one, that enables them to even just sing a bit, live for another.
yes. And we'll definitely speak about the freedom much later on, because he addresses it later on after discussing a little bit about the conditions in which they lived under. So I'm going to hold the thoughts about those intrinsic freedoms, and just now to get a sense of what camp life was like. And he's talked about the fight for hunger and the loss of dignity, etc. So now, but interestingly enough, he's discussing a cultural life, and the question is, why is it relevant? Why is a cultural life even finding its way into this conversation? Prof. Isaiah?
You have to strengthen yourself from within, in a place where no guards or police can come in. And I remember in reading the life of John Paul II, that when the Germans had invaded his country, he and a bunch of other youngsters were doing theater and drama under, in the night, hidden and probably facing a lot of danger, because they saw it as a weapon to empower themselves and to fight against the brutality around them.
Okay. Frida, you want to just explain about the necessity of a culture, why a culture matters?
Yes, and I think this relates to the earlier questions on the spirituality and the apathy. We have things that anchor us to who we are. And once we lose sight of that, then we lose our humanity. So having a cultural life is one of the ways of actually remaining rooted in a world that has gone chaotic. And that is why they needed something that they could actually hold on to say that's fine, the world is falling apart, but we as a people are still human beings, we are worth it, and we will still have these things once all this is over. Thank you.
Hey, I'll tell you this. You see, when human beings come together, they do something. They will do something, and that thing that people are going to do is actually what we call their culture, right? So he talks about politics, and that was one thing that they always talked about. And then there was religion. And then the third thing that we do is now this, the poetry and the music, etc. Before I continue, Nicholas, you wanted to add on to that?
I'm just thinking he is trying to humanize. He's trying to bring some sense of humanity, some sense of quote unquote, is it normalcy or something like that. He's trying to humanize what they are going through. Remember, he's already forgotten his former life. So he's now coming up with a new word, cultural hibernation. In fact, I'm not too sure it can be hibernation, because he has already forgotten. He struck out his former life. So here he's just trying to show a humanity of some sense. Now that things are very thick in there, he's just trying to show us a sense of humanity, of how they used to do things in an everyday life, because that is his objective, to show life in his eyes on a normal, in a quote unquote normal day. How was a normal day?
Yes.
That's what I'm thinking.
Now you're leading us there. Yes, he was talking about what life was like, what life on a day-to-day, what life was, right? And indeed, I think it's something that also Ruby has just mentioned, that it's like there was a hibernation. There was no culture as such, right? Because in any society, there's something that is always happening. There's the music they listen to, and the stories that they tell, and the poems that they engage in. And that the music, the poetry, the stories that they tell, their artwork, is actually a reflection of who they are spiritually as a people. Which I remember there was people, the conversation we were having in Kenya about gengeton and is gengeton music, etc. You know, the truth is, of course, gengeton is part of our society, people. This is me just going away a little bit. Gengeton is part of the music we listen to. And more than saying stop listening to it and it's bad music, it's a question is if gengeton is a reflection of the music that we're listening to, what does it say about us as a people? So this is what, so the culture, when you study the culture of these people, then you understand a little bit. So now let's go back to the camp life. And he says, yes, something important. He says there was a culture, you know, was in hibernation, obviously. You know, there was no time that they sat and they wrote poetry and that they wrote, you know, beautiful works. They painted beautiful works of art. And that's why he says that sort of high culture, you know, died and wasn't there anymore. And of course, then that's when he says there was a culture of sorts. But interestingly, notice at the end, what does he say? It was meant to help us. The bad jokes and the bad singing, it was meant to help us. And it did. And it did. Which then points us to just the value of this, of art and music and these things in any society. I say this because obviously we're living in a society where we don't put in that much in these things. But you notice that in our most desperate moments, we realize just how important these things are. Think about just us having this book club discussion. Yeah, in the middle of how important everything is and everybody's going through things, you want to have spaces where you experience a little bit of culture. So that's what we're talking about, and that's why it was so important, because it feeds the soul. There's something that these things do to us, and they're not additional, they're necessary. How do we know that they're necessary? Because Viktor Frankl tells us that at times they would miss a meal just to go and listen to this bad art. But it was something which then shifts focus, or it shifts it shifts our understanding to realize that this feeding of the spirit was just as important as feeding of these people's souls. It was important, and they felt it. You didn't need to be taught. It was something that they understood, which then takes us to the question of an inner life, right? Because caught up, he says earlier, he tells us earlier, they were caught up always in the necessity of the task of staying alive. The prisoner's inner life was reduced to a primitive level. All they thought about then was, where will my next meal come from? And that's, you know, where will my next meal come from? How will I stay alive? How will my friends stay alive? And that's all happened. So then you ask, in this kind of environment, then what kind of an inner life did these people have? Did they even have an inner life anymore in these grueling circumstances? And I share with you the statement that Viktor Frankl tells us. Sensitive people who were used to a rich intellectual life may have suffered much pain, parenthesis, they were often of a delicate constitution, so of course they suffered pain, but the damage to their inner selves was less. Why? Because they were able to retreat from their terrible surroundings to a life of inner riches and spiritual freedom. And then he talks about his own experience. Occasionally, I looked at the sky where the stars were fading and the pink light of the mornings was beginning to spread behind a dark bank of clouds. But my mind clung to my wife's image, imagining it with an uncanny acuteness. For the first time, I saw the truth that love is the ultimate and the highest goal to which man can aspire. I understood how a man who has nothing left in this world still may know bliss, be it only for a brief moment, in the contemplation of his beloved. The intensification of inner life helped the prisoner to find a refuge from the emptiness, desolation, and spiritual poverty of his existence by letting him escape into the past, ... And then as the inner life of the prisoner tended to become more intense, he also experienced the beauty of art and nature as never before. So now we shift inwardly, because here's the question. Given these circumstances where people were fighting for survival, how can there be any life inwardly? How can one have a possibility of contemplating beauty, art, music, whatever, their beloved? And what's the answer for this? Viktor Frankl says yes. People who had an intellectual life, who were able to cultivate this inner life, and so camp life for them was a lot easier. Do you agree with him? Does this make sense to you, Viktor Frankl's statement? Michael, Babu? Did it make sense, the inner life?
Yes, what you've just mentioned reminds me of a quote that states that if there is no enemy within, the enemy outside can do no harm.
Good.
And I guess that is what he was highlighting, that in the battles of life, victory has to be won or has to be witnessed from within the individual and then manifest outside. So when he was pointing it out is that, yes, agreed, you know, the couples were calling them pigs and all these things, but one had to approve of it internally for it to manifest externally. And I think that is what he was highlighting. So personally, I've always used that path to overcome any obstacle that I go through, in that I always have to speak to Babu within me, you know, and have a very deep conversation with him and just tell him that if you change what you see changes, and that is basically internal. So that's my main focus, and I fully agree with his sentiments.
Okay, now the next person who's going to speak, I mean, and I want you to also focus a little bit about contemplation and contemplation of the beloved, and the moment when he realizes how that just thinking of his wife gave him such strength. Before I come to you, Prof. Israel, I see here Annette Omuna.
Okay, reflections on my part. Obviously, he mentioned 3 things when the book began, which are important for us when we're searching for meaning. And of course, an important one was love, and how ideally discovering love gives you something to look forward to. For me, it's, I guess it's both, I don't know, it's both positive and negative, because I thought, what about those who don't have these as something they, you know, something they have or even think they can look forward to? It still provides for me, it challenged me, like, is that something now people should strive to ensure that they have this in their lives, or how do we make it possible for everyone to see this as a source of a meaning? Yeah.
Actually, what you say is really powerful, that what happens if I don't have an inner life, if all my life is external? Welcome to COVID-19, because that's all it did. It helped us realize, forget about the commute to work, forget about all these office meetings, just sit in your house and sit quietly and develop an inner life. Because obviously you wake up in the morning and you keep on being thrown back to yourself. And then what Annette is saying is so important, because, but then what happens when I go in there and I find actually there is nothing in there? You know, there's some cobwebs, there's a lot of, you know, but there's not too much inner life. Precisely. So that means that the inner life has to be fed. I think Michael describes it really well when he says it starts from the outside. So it's what he says to himself, to the inner person. So more than what they say to themselves, is what he's talking about is that he introduces new thoughts and new ideas and new ways of thinking. So the inner life is fed from outside, and then it's watered from the inside. Okay, and so in the case of Viktor Frankl, the wife is external to him, but he loves her from within. So he contemplates her. So that's happening internally. but it's happening internally to somebody that is external. So there's a sort of dance that goes on of feeding this inner life. But he also talks about beauty and nature and says how these then help to feed that. And books and reading and great films and great songs and great poems. Yes, Prof. Israel, the inner life and how it gave purpose and contemplation of beauty and love.
Yes, you see, there is a law, universal law in this thing we are discussing here, and we find it around. I have read a book called Left to Tell by this Rwandese lady called Immaculée Libagiza. She counts in the book her experience of being, I think, for 4 months with 5 other women in a toilet, hidden, because if she were to be discovered even by the son of the person who was hiding them, they would be killed in Rwanda. And this woman, in those 4 months, she underwent an incredible transformation. She established a fantastic relationship with Jesus. She read the Bible. Jesus talked to her, showed her her future husband, and all sorts of stuff. And this is a clear example of what Frankl was saying. If you are rich inside, if you find your inner riches, they think of contemplating of the beloved, inner rich spiritual freedom, then actually the external bit matters little. The same thing happened with Saint Josemaria during the Spanish Civil War. From 31 up to 39, it was hell on earth. The communists took over Spain. They killed 6,000 priests and bishops, etc. They were after everybody. And this man was going around, flying almost, because the Holy Spirit was talking to him. He was finding solace in God, and then going around consoling people, his students, and then his mother and the sister and the brother. So this is something that we have to discover and tell other people, because people are blind to this. They think that their riches are cars and plots of land and houses and good watches and good perfume, and it is not true.
That's powerful. And you know how you know? Remember how people always say that, oh, but you know, it's nice when you've got the Mercedes. Do you know how you know whether the Mercedes is helping you? I'm picking up from what Prof. Israel is saying. It's because in a moment of stress, is contemplating the Mercedes giving you joy right now? Is contemplating, you see what I mean? I mean, it's not a difficult test at all. It is very simple. Think about when you think about, oh my goodness, this is so beautiful. Actually, sometimes maybe contemplating a piece of chocolate might give you slightly more joy than would, you know, contemplating my beautiful house, or, you know, some of these things. Or even, and this is really the saddest one, contemplating my title, you know, that I am the vice president of the bank, of the banks of the world, of the regional hub. Does that give you joy? And does that feed you? And that's a very easy test that for one to realize that actually, no. Yes, I mean, these things are there, yes or no, that's not really the point. But what really, really matters for you at that point in time will be when you realize that, oh my goodness, it was thinking about the beloved, and think how beautiful it was. It's such an ode to love, the way Frankl describes it. Yeah, when he talks about his wife and he says, just thinking about her, and he wanted to continue thinking about her. He saw her and she sees him, right? For some people, this is the point where they'll talk about, you know, they see God and God sees them, and that's enough, right? So it's that idea. He looks at his wife and his wife looks at him, and that was enough. And he gets irritated, you know, that, oh, they're calling him to go and shovel some snow or whatever it was that he needed to do. But he got back to that moment and he wanted to stay there with her. And that's why he says that it was such a blissful moment, because in the middle of this ugliness and cruelty, just thinking about her brought him such joy. And that's when he understood that statement that, bliss, there is bliss in contemplation. There is bliss in contemplation. And this is it. So the ability to do that, to the joy that comes from within to see this. And that also now then comes with the idea of beauty, that's the purpose of beauty in our life, of the value of it. Ugliness, a beauty sort of draws us away from this ugliness. And now back to the point that was made by Annette. When you see the beauty, then the ugliness is not so ugly. And that's how you invite it in. People will talk about nature walks, they'll talk about, the sea, works of art, whatever, but things that fit the spirit. Caroline Shisubili?
It's just what you're saying, really. I think, I'm reading your mind, because as you talk about the ocean and the forest, it's just what I was typing. So let me not repeat it. It's just what you're explaining.
So then we're now going to the second and obviously more important part, and I suspect the reason why we are here, which is trying to find meaning, right? So because now he talks about, the rich intellectual life. But before we get to that point, I thought it would be good that we discuss a little bit on an important idea that he introduced to us. We've heard about it, but maybe now we think a little bit, we have an opportunity to think about it. Humor, the importance of humor. You ask, how can we even discuss humor in this crazy situation? How can you even want us to start laughing? But here he says, humor was another, what is he talking about? The first was contemplation, inner life, all that, so they would look out into the sunset. Imagine these prisoners who were suffering so much would look out into the sunset and remember when one of his friends says, oh, if only the world was always like this, as they were looking at the sunset, how beautiful. If ever you've watched the film Shawshank Redemption,
yes.
Remember in Shawshank Redemption, there's a moment where he locks himself in the warden's room and he begins to play this beautiful aria, opera piece, right? And he plays this beautiful aria, and all the prisoners, these are hardened killers, but they all look up, and he says, none of us, we didn't know what she was saying, but it was really beautiful, right? So at that, it's sort of like the saving power of beauty that he's talking about. So that's the first point. The second point that Viktor Frankl is drawing us to is humor. Humor was another of the soul's weapon in the fight for self-preservation. I practically trained a friend of mine who worked next to me on a building site to develop a sense of humor. To see things in a humorous light is some kind of trick learned while mastering the art of living. So we always assume that, you hear a joke, you laugh. It's not hard. But of course, in a difficult situation, there's a tendency for one to focus on the negative. Why? Because suffering completely fills the human soul and conscious mind, no matter whether the suffering is great or little. I thought that was that in a sense answers all the questions you've ever had, frankly speaking, at least that, how is it possible? Because sometimes you, break a nail or you stub your toe and someone says, oh, come on, cheer up. There are people starving in Sudan. And you think, okay, yeah, it's true, there are people starving in Sudan, but I'm also feeling this pain right now. Well, first, of course, pain is individual. That the pain of another person doesn't necessarily make your stubbed toe that much easier to bear. But Viktor Frankl has introduced us to an interesting idea that it depends. Suffering, no matter how small it is, fills the soul, and then it eclipses everything else. It eclipses everything else that's going on. And so one has to sort of, he needed to make an effort to to find humor in the situation. People, do you think that this made sense at this point in time to find the humor in the situation? Was it even possible, or is it possible really to find humor? Babu, Michael?
Thank you. I was just echoing what you were saying about seeing beauty in the times of turmoil, and you know, from what I've been reading and learning is there's a professor who says that he loves being around children because children have the gift of allowing an adult to see an ordinary thing anew. If they see a bag which you have seen for, I don't know, 30, 40 years, their level of awe just allows you to see that bag in a new dimension. And I was reading this, I was thinking that, you know, in this period of COVID-19, some of us have grown to appreciate the value of what we found to be ordinary and normal, you know, the gift of going out when you want to, the value of relationships, being with people, the depth of having a hug from a friend, the value of a handshake, you know, all these things that we found to be extremely normal have now been given a higher sense of value, and it has all been born as a result of this sense of unrest. So as he was highlighting it, and even when it draws into the humor, is as he said, for him, he had to convince himself to see things differently, you know, in that he calls it a trick. He had to master a trick of finding humor in all this turmoil, you know, because he says suffering was omnipresent, which is a very powerful statement to think about, you know. But he had to train his mind to see, I don't know, see abnormally, if I may use that word. But yeah, he had to see an abnormal situation of things in order for him to find the humor in it. Or else, as you were saying, if you hurt your toe, it definitely hurts, but it depends with what you will see out of it. Or else you will just focus on the pain and not see the, I don't know, the experience in it. So that was just what I was trying to highlight there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Okay, there we got you. And then I have DK and then Nicholas Njero. Yes, DK.
Thank you. To me, I see humor on a very broad spectrum in terms of, I'm connecting it to the earlier points we talked of: cultural inhibition, inferiority complex, self-preservation. Me, I'm taking humor as a way to escape. For the prisoners, I remember, if it's the same movie you said, The Shawshank, they formed a baseball team, and they actually found that as a sense of togetherness. Remember, this was a prison that had a big divide. Normal in any society, you find a lot of divide because people get into their cocoons, into their interests. But there are those common activities or interests that bring people together. And we can say one is, as you mentioned, religion, one can be politics, another is, and a large one and a positive one, of course, is sports, especially in our, and these are humor because they bring joy, they bring togetherness, they bring a form of togetherness on a good front. Because you can imagine, these people were together not in a very positive situation. They were prisoners. But now this gave them an escape to be together, but on a good common ground. So humor, and even in our today's life, as Michael well put, you know, we took for granted neighborliness, a common handshake. You were always getting upset with the traffic. Now you're like, I wouldn't mind just seeing the normal road. Bringing us together in a good front. I see humor in that light, and it brings, because he talks of self-actualization, and that is, I'm also looking at it in a form of being in a place that you should be. It's not necessarily the big car, the prestige, the level of in society is just being in what you should be, because we all know what our common life should be. These were prisoners taken as adults, so they did know what their life was. So, and they do know what life they have been denied. So to me, humor is very important to enable them to start to, again, come to a, remember earlier they had an emotional death way of self-preservation, and I termed it, or I linked it to acceptance. Now that they have come to an acceptance, they have decided the way that they are going to grow from that acceptance is humor. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Nicholas?
Let me just take it from her last sentence, linking humor to the previous acceptance and apathy. For me, it was a big struggle to getting humor and apathy in the same one person. Seeing that one, he tells us humor is one of the soul's weapons, and we are coming from a point where he has zero emotional connection. He now has apathy. Apathy is the new normal now. Then now he's mentioning humor, and I'm just trying to merge the two, and it's, to me, looks like an oxymoron. It's one of those challenges where how do you find humor in such a context? Today you're apathetic, and then tomorrow you tell me you're humorous. How does that happen? I think it's a very big challenge, and it's a big struggle, really. However, the humor is really an invention. It is an invention, and a critical one for that matter in this context. So that for me was quite an interesting to come across.
Wow, that's powerful. I'll use that with your permission, Nicholas, from now on, that humor was an invention. They needed to invent humor, right? I love that word. I'm going to use it. Humor was an invention. They invented humor. They needed to invent humor. Why? Because it didn't exist. There were no opportunities for it. So in a sense, they needed to be creative about it. Why did they need to do that? Don't forget, the reason they needed to do that was because everything around them gave them reason to be negative, to precisely be apathetic, to all these things. Everything around them was one more reason why I cannot smile, was one more reason why I have to be apathetic. So in a sense, to have a space, an intact space around them of just living is now. The tool that they chose was what? The tool that they chose was to use humor, okay? And so that was an invention. We're now moving towards finding meaning. Remember, he's describing all these situations. So now we're moving towards finding meaning, because the question that he asks is, in the middle of all this, how could they find meaning in all this? So now he's talking about, the first is value. A man's character became involved, obviously. I mean, this was a situation where your character became involved, because at each point in time you were making decisions, right? So a man's character became involved, that he was caught in a mental turmoil which threatened all the values he had and threw them in doubt. Under the influence of a world which no longer recognized the value of human life and human dignity, which robbed man of his will and had made him an object to be exterminated, the personal ego finally suffered a loss of values. It is to this point, obviously, that Viktor Frankl has been bringing us the possibility and sort of an explanation of how we all got to the point where the person suffered a loss of values. Now, there's a caveat. He makes a caveat, and I'm going to make the same caveat. I'm just going to highlight the caveat that he makes. He says, no, don't pass judgments until you know very well that in the same circumstances, you would not have done the same thing. We were talking about this during the COVID time. Somebody and I was talking about this, and we said, oh my goodness, what do we do when, maybe it's going to, they're going to, okay, it's true we've got the curfew, but what if now we can't get to get food anymore? And then they come and they surround our homes. And then you have, robbers at the gate saying, we're coming in, we want food. And then, all the food that you have hoarded for yourself, you might have to share. And then someone said, but those are the moments you see people in the movies holding a gun saying, go away or I'm going to shoot you. And the people at the gate say, but I have children, please let us in. And it takes a tough person to say, no, we only have enough food for ourselves. And obviously that's a moral dilemma for all of us. And I don't know if we've all undergone some kind of moral dilemmas. So until you're placed in exactly that moment, obviously, one can't really judge what would I do until you're confronted with that situation. Nonetheless, Viktor Frankl has asked this question, has said, given these were moments when a person's character was tested, where one's personal ego was tested because the value of human life and their dignity they were robbed and completely exterminated. And then obviously for this reason, they completely lost any sense of values. Does anyone, are you able to at least explain, in your understanding, the link between the loss of human, their dignity, the loss of human, no longer recognized as the value of human dignity, the value of human life, how that once they were robbed of that, there was a possibility of them losing their values, their sense of values and their personal ego. All that went out of the wood. Can anyone just sort of explain a little bit how you have understood the link between that? How did the jump happen? I'll have Ruby first and then Frida, please.
I see the link, and it takes me back to when we were discussing apathy and the emotional detachment, and when they could see somebody suffering and experience no emotion, which was a value they had lost, feeling empathetic, feeling sad for somebody else's suffering. Viktor, he also talks about when a nurse was dragging the dead body of somebody down the steps and his head was hitting, and he felt nothing, and he was shocked at how detached he was. So that was a loss of values, and I suppose I could see that as an example of how they lost value because of the indignity of the experiences they're having in the camp.
Frida?
Bringing it closer home, it's a bit easy to judge when you have all you need. And when I went for the launch of Nairobi Noir, and when I read the book and I talked to a few people, it was really a bloodline in terms of you're living in Dandora, you're a mother of 5 children, you live in a one-room shack, your children have to steal for you guys to eat. And when they're caught stealing, the mother has to pay through sexual favors with police so that they don't get arrested. And you ask yourself, what would you have done in their shoes? You wouldn't really know what you'd have done in their shoes. So it's a bit like, we can judge because at that point in time, you have enough food on the table, you have a job, you have a salary at the end of the month, but they don't have that luxury. Same to the woman who's selling on the streets. She has been caught because she's hawking. And to avoid jail, she has to have sex with the policeman. What would you do? You have 7 children to feed in a slum, and the only thing you have to sell is those vegetables, So it's very easy to have those lines blurred in terms, and I mean, the connection you're asking, it's very easy to have the dignity of the human being reduced to something that it's not, based on the circumstance you find yourself in. Now, what normally happens is for those who had a basis, for example, in their spirituality or their culture, they are able to find a balance between the two. It's not like they will justify what they have done, but they will be able to move on and say, okay, it was expedient at a particular point in time. I wouldn't do it in other circumstances, but because I've been caught up in this, then I can actually move on. And I won't feel guilty about it, because were you in my shoes, maybe you wouldn't have done any differently. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Wamboi, just to wrap up that point, yes?
I think that the experiences that they were going through in camp and, you know, the mistreatment by the couples, it left them with an inferiority complex. So if they had no value in their own life, if they didn't see their own dignity, I think it's then very hard for them to see the dignity in other people. So if so then it becomes very hard to treat the other prisoners with dignities. So they drag the bodies, they watch other people being mistreated and feeling nothing about it. So I think it goes, if I have no value, if I don't see the value of my own life, then it's very hard to see the value of the other people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And to also see to see any value in even what I do, because it really does not matter. Yeah, there was that possibility, because what did it matter anymore? I was garbage. I was treated like garbage, and therefore it doesn't matter. I am a dog. Remember the man who, that moment where he says the indignity of having the couple throw a stone at him. He didn't even stand up. He wasn't worth the couple getting up from where he was to come and you know, beat him or whatever. He picks up a stone and throws it and flings it to him as if he was no more than a dog. And for that reason, when one is confronted with a situation where their own dignity is not upheld and it's assaulted consistently, then they themselves think, okay, so what does it matter if I make any grand heroic gestures? They don't matter. It doesn't matter if I make a great act of charity or if I save this other person, because, you know, I'm nothing. I really am this thing that people are, you know, are the way that they are treating me. So then people, against this background, COVID-19, we ask the question, and I know this is why you all came and have been waiting for it, so you can ask everyone else to jump in. Then what's the meaning? What meaning can we give to this suffering? Is there any meaning in the suffering, or are we going to have one long night of savagery and then we die? So Viktor Frankl introduces this idea by saying, I may give the impression that the human being is completely and unavoidably influenced by his surrounding. But what about human liberty? Is there no spiritual freedom in regard to behavior and reaction to any given surrounding? Of course, right? All these things were happening to them back and forth. They had the fight for survival, a tendency towards dark humor. There was no cultural life. One was tempted to become apathetic. And so, of course, we are now at the point where Viktor Frankl says, what do you do against this background where there was literally no more freedom? Yeah, you had the wolves at the door and no way out, and everyone hunkers down. And Viktor Frankl's response to this is, the way in which a man accepts his fate and all suffering it entails, the way he takes up his cross, gives him an ample opportunity, even under the most difficult circumstance, to add a deeper meaning to his life. Everywhere, man is confronted with fate, with the chance of achieving something through his own suffering. Okay? So, there is that opportunity he talks about, that confronted with what is going on, man is confronted with the opportunity of achieving something through this thing that is going on. Now, bear in mind that the man telling us this is in a prison camp. And he has absolutely no control. And this is the man who is telling us that there is the possibility of achieving something. I suppose that's no excuse for anybody else after this. But don't forget, suffering is individual. Suffering is individual. So you have to find your own meaning. So what's the next sentence is that he says that. Now, before I read out the next slide, notice before he was talking about the end, what is the objective? Because you see, there's the kind of suffering where if you go to the doctor and then the doctor is, or the dentist, I hope you don't have to, but if you go to the dentist, those people will drill your tooth and do all sorts of things to you, which are extremely painful. But at the end of it all, you know the meaning of that suffering. It's very clear to you. I have to go through that so for this to happen. But you know, sometimes we are confronted with a meaninglessness suffering. Why? Why am I in this camp? Why are we sitting? Why am I going through this? Why did that child have to die? Right? So in a sense, there's no meaning to this. There's no goal. There's no purpose to it. And that's when Viktor Frankl is talking about an end and a goal. He says, a man who could not see the end of his provisional existence was not able to aim at an ultimate goal in life. Therefore, the whole structure of his inner life changed. Signs of decay set in. A man who let himself decline forgot that often it is such an exceptionally difficulty to grow spiritual. In such a moment, it's exceptionally difficulty to grow spiritually beyond himself. I've obviously jumped, certain passages here. So the challenge here is the temptation one has, because you can see no end in suffering, because you cannot see the purpose of what is going on, one therefore just, engages in spiritual decay. And we allow ourselves to decay and to, because we cannot see why. There's a beautiful example he gives of unemployed mine workers. I think it was in Cuba, where because they're unemployed, they had no work, they sort of gave into a sort of spiritual decay. And we don't have to go too far, yeah? In the shopping centers in most towns, in Nairobi, in Kenya, have you noticed how there's always a group of young men who just sit there because they have no work day after day? So you kind of give into a spiritual decay. There's that temptation. Why? Because you don't know, will I get a job tomorrow? Will I have a way of living tomorrow or not? So he says, if one is not able to find meaning in that, because they don't see a goal, then there's a possibility of giving into this spiritual decay. Vivian, more importantly now, I just want, if you can, it's just one intervention I would like. Vivian, if you can interpret.
This book I was given by a priest friend of mine. And the reason he gave it to me was that I lived a bit of a difficult moment with my child. He had leukemia. So we had to almost 4 years of hospital, medication and stuff. So he gave me this book. And when I was reading it, I saw this point of if you don't have a meaning, you cannot even have a meaning for your child. Your child looks at you and how you're reacting to his situation. And if he sees you crumbling, he also doesn't have hope. So I had to be sure to have hope for my child so that he can see that I have hope and he doesn't lose hope. And for me to achieve that, I had to go, to question, what do I believe in? We say we believe in God. Is it really true to believe in that I believe in God? Am I certain that for everything he has a reason why he's giving me this situation? And living this, questioning myself, and living seriously that moment as a chance to verify whether I believe or not in God, I was able to have this certainty that I was able to also communicate to my son and my husband, and understanding what was the meaning. And even sometimes when I talk to him, I ask him, so when we were, what do you think about, because he had to get out of school, so he's a year behind. We lived in a foreign country. We had to live in Italy for treatment. And so I asked him, so what do you see about it? He's able to pick, for example, that he can speak a foreign language. In as much as he sees there are many things, he's a year behind his classmates, he lost some of his friends and stuff, but he's he speaks a foreign language. His mind is a little bit more open. He's been exposed to many things. And I tell him, you see, this is a positive side. In as much as you were out of school, you were in another school. Not necessarily the system of school that you expected, but you're in another system of school. And I see, for example, now when I tell him about something. So we saw a book about the doctor in China who discovered the sickness. I saw him immediately. We read the book. He went to Google, how did the doctor get this disease and where is he right now? And unfortunately, he died. And so this is a thing I've seen about him, to go deeper, not to just take things at the surface. You know, he loves football. He goes deeper to find out, oh, who won the World Cup in 82. So he has some funny facts. And this is because of living an inner life, taking everything seriously. So when I sit back and I look, I see some of these things. Maybe I was taking my parenting for granted. But living this moment with my son, I was able to take parenting in a more serious way, being present, wanting to expose him to as many things as possible. I don't think this would have happened if he had never become sick. So this fighting to understand what it meant, fighting to give my son also a meaning, was able to help us get through the process.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And now you're leading us gracefully again to the next point that he makes precisely, that against this circumstance of picking up one's cross, then what does one do? You see, he says, Viktor Frankl says to us, what was really needed was a fundamental change in our attitude towards life. We needed to stop asking about the meaning of life. What does life mean? Stop asking that question, and instead to think of ourselves as those who are being questioned by life. What does this moment demand from me right now? Yeah. So it's not so much what do I find? No. What does this moment demand from me in right action and in right conduct? Life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answer to its problems and to fulfill the task which it constantly sets for each individual. These tasks and therefore the meaning of life differ from man to man and from moment to moment. Thus, it is impossible to define the meaning of life in a general way. Get that, people? It's not general. Oh, you know, we live in this life so that we can do this. No, it's not general. And this becomes more acute, obviously, when one is confronted with a really painful situation or really, really difficult circumstance. Because at that point in time, platitudes will not do it. At that point in time, what we really, really want is something which is definitive. And therefore, it says, thus it's impossible to define it in a general way. What we need to find is something specific. Life doesn't mean something vague, but something real and concrete, just as life tasks are also very real and concrete. They form a man's destiny, which is different and unique for each individual. So two ideas have emerged in this book, and we can use them as our final comments. The one is that no matter how difficult the circumstances are, there's always that space between stimulus and action, which is a moment, which is that moment that we call freedom. That's what freedom is, when we determine how we are going to act. And that space, everybody has it. We all have that space of how am I going to act to this in this situation. One. Two, well, I'm going to find meaning in this situation. I am going to find meaning in this situation, you say. But to find this meaning is very personal. It's very personal. And I love Vivian's comment. She's so right that she had to find a very personal and very concrete meaning. It's never general. It's almost, if you want to say, tangible, something you can touch and say, the meaning for what we are going through right now is that this child learned a foreign language. There was an actual meaning. And therefore, it's never general. And obviously, that means that everyone has to take a journey inward to find their meaning in their particular situation.